Carlos walked down the cobblestone streets of the small town, his steps slow and purposeful. The town's charm was undeniable with its vintage storefronts and welcoming atmosphere, yet he felt a pang of melancholy. It had been years since the accident, but the memories of his family haunted him daily. Today, however, something compelled him to explore the antique store that had recently opened on Main Street. As he entered the shop, the scent of aged wood and musty books filled the air. Carlos wandered through the aisles, his fingers brushing against old furniture and trinkets, until he stopped in front of a display of old photographs. One picture in particular caught his eye, a black and white image of a family standing in front of a large house. The faces were familiar yet distant, like a faded dream. He picked up the photograph, examining it closely. The house in the background seemed to stir a memory, but he couldn't quite place it. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the doorbell as another customer entered the store. Helena, on the other side of town, was trying to rebuild her life. She had left everything behind to escape her abusive past and sought solace in the anonymity of the small town. The antique store became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in history and forget her own troubles. That same morning, she decided to visit the store, hoping to find something that would brighten her modest apartment. As she browsed through the aisles, she noticed a man standing still, staring intently at a photograph. Intrigued, she approached him. "Hi, I'm Helena. Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Carlos turned to her, a mixture of confusion and sadness in his eyes. "I'm Carlos. I was just looking at this photograph. Do you know anything about it?" Helena glanced at the photograph and felt a jolt of recognition. The house in the background looked eerily similar to one she had seen in her childhood, but the memory was too hazy to grasp. "I don't, but it's strange. That house looks familiar." The conversation sparked a connection between them. They shared their stories. Carlos spoke of his family's tragic accident, and Helena shared her escape from a life of fear. The more they talked, the more they realized they were kindred spirits, both seeking answers and healing. Carlos hesitated, then decided to show Helena the photograph up close. As they examined it together, something caught their eye. In the corner of the picture, almost hidden in the shadows, was a young girl who looked remarkably like Helena. Helena's breath caught in her throat. "This can't be possible. I don't remember ever being in a photo like this." Carlos felt a surge of determination. "Maybe this is a sign. We should find out more about this photograph. It might hold the key to understanding our pasts." With a sense of purpose, they left the antique store, the photograph clutched tightly in Carlos's hand. Little did they know that this chance encounter would set them on a journey that would uncover secrets, test their resilience, and ultimately lead them to discover the unexpected ways their lives were intertwined. They walked to a nearby cafe, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods enveloped them as they entered. They found a quiet corner table, and Carlos spread the photograph out on the table between them. Helena studied the image, her fingers tracing the outline of the house. "Do you remember anything about this house?" Carlos asked, watching her intently. Helena shook her head. "No, it's just a vague feeling, like a half-remembered dream. But that girl, she looked so much like me when I was younger." Carlos nodded. "There's something about this photograph. I feel like it's connected to my family somehow, but I can't explain why." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Then Helena spoke up. "We should talk to the owner of the antique store. Maybe he knows where the photograph came from." Carlos agreed, and they finished their coffee quickly, eager to return to the store. As they walked back, the town's peaceful atmosphere seemed to contrast sharply with the turmoil of their thoughts. The antique store's owner, Mr. Almeida, was a kindly old man with a wealth of knowledge about the items in his shop. When they re-entered the store, Mr. Almeida greeted them with a warm smile. "Back so soon? Did you find something interesting?" Carlos held up the photograph. "Mr. Almeida, can you tell us anything about this photo? Where did it come from?" Mr. Almeida adjusted his glasses and took the photograph from Carlos. He examined it closely, his brow furrowing in concentration. Ah, yes. I remember this one. It came from an estate sale a few months ago. The family had lived in the area for generations. Helena leaned forward. Do you remember the name of the family? Mr. Almeida thought for a moment. I believe it was the Rodriguez family. They owned a large house on the outskirts of town. It's been abandoned for years now. Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance. This could be the lead they were looking for. Thank you, Mr. Almeida, Carlos said. We'll have to check it out. As they left the store, Carlos turned to Helena. It looks like we're going on a little adventure. Helena smiled, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. I guess we are. Let's hope we find some answers. They drove to the outskirts of town, where the old Rodriguez house stood, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The sight of the house sent a shiver down Helena's spine. It felt both familiar and strange, like a place she had visited in a dream. Carlos pushed open the rusted gate, and they walked up the overgrown path to the front door. The house loomed over them, a silent sentinel of the past. They exchanged a glance, and Carlos knocked on the door, though he doubted anyone would answer. To their surprise, the door creaked open. The inside of the house was dim and filled with dust. Sunlight filtered through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under their feet. As they explored the house, they found remnants of the past, old furniture covered in sheets, family portraits on the walls, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. In one of the rooms, they found a large, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished with age. Helena gazed at her reflection, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. This place, it feels like a part of me, she whispered. Carlos placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll find the answers, Helena. Together. They continued their search, and in the attic, they found a trunk filled with old documents and photographs. As they sifted through the papers, they discovered letters and journals that told the story of the Rodriguez family, stories of love, loss, and secrets. One letter in particular caught Helena's eye. It was addressed to her mother, from a woman named Maria Rodriguez. The letter spoke of a secret child, hidden away to protect her from a dark past. Helena's hands trembled as she read the words. Carlos, this letter, it's about me, she said, her voice shaking. I was the secret child. Carlos took the letter from her, reading it quickly. This is incredible. It means your family and mine were connected. This must be why the photograph was so important. Helena nodded, tears in her eyes. We have to find out more. There must be more clues here. They spent hours in the attic, piecing together the fragments of the past. By the time they left the house, they had a clearer picture of their family's intertwined histories. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but they knew they had to face it together. As they drove back to town, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Helena looked at Carlos, a sense of hope blooming in her heart. Thank you, Carlos. For everything. Carlos smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. We're in this together, Helena. We'll find the truth, no matter what. And so, their journey began, two souls bound by fate, seeking answers and healing in the midst of a small town's forgotten secrets. Carlos and Helena sat in the cafe, the photograph spread out between them. The revelation that Helena might be the young girl in the picture had left them both shaken. The cafe's cozy atmosphere, with its soft lighting and gentle hum of conversation, contrasted sharply with the turmoil they felt inside. Helena couldn't tear her eyes away from the photograph. It's like looking at a ghost, she murmured. I don't remember ever being in that house, but that girl, she looks exactly like me. Carlos nodded, his mind racing. We need to find out more about this photograph. If the Rodriguez family lived in that house, maybe someone in town can tell us more about them. Helena agreed, though the idea of uncovering her past filled her with a mix of fear and curiosity. They decided their first step would be to visit the local library to search for any records or information about the Rodriguez family. The library was a quaint building, with tall shelves filled with books and a faint smell of old paper. The librarian, Mrs. Parker, was a friendly woman in her 60s who seemed to know everything about the town's history. "We're looking for information on the Rodriguez family," Carlos explained. "They used to live in a large house on the outskirts of town." Mrs. Parker's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, the Rodriguez family. They were quite prominent in their time. Follow me, I think we have some old records and newspapers that might help." She led them to a back room filled with dusty archives. Carlos and Helena spent hours sifting through old documents, piecing together the story of the Rodriguez family. They learned that the family had been wealthy and influential, but their fortune had dwindled over the years, leading to the house being abandoned. Helena found a newspaper clipping that caught her attention. It was an article about a tragic accident involving the Rodriguez family, dated around the time she would have been a child. "Carlos, look at this," she said, handing him the clipping. The article described a fire that had destroyed part of the Rodriguez estate, resulting in several deaths. The details were sparse, but it mentioned that a young child had been rescued from the blaze and sent to live with distant relatives. The child's name was not mentioned, but Helena couldn't shake the feeling that it was her. "This has to be it," Helena whispered. "I must have been that child." Carlos nodded slowly. "It makes sense. And it explains why you don't remember much about it. Trauma like that can make you forget." They continued their research, uncovering more about the family's decline and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the fire. But there were still many unanswered questions, and they knew they needed to find someone who had first-hand knowledge of the events. Their next stop was the town's historical society, a small building run by a few dedicated volunteers. They met Mr. Thompson, an elderly man with a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. He listened intently as Carlos and Helena explained their findings and showed him the photograph. "I remember the Rodriguez family," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "The fire was a terrible tragedy. Many believed it was an accident, but there were always rumors of foul play." Helena felt a chill run down her spine. "Foul play? What do you mean?" Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There were whispers that someone set the fire on purpose. But nothing was ever proven, and over time, people forgot about it. The family scattered, and the house fell into ruin." Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance. This new information added a layer of complexity to their investigation. If the fire had been deliberate, who would have wanted to harm the Rodriguez family, and why? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, they thanked Mr. Thompson and left the Historical Society. Their next plan was to visit the old Rodriguez house again, hoping to find more clues that could shed light on what had happened. As they drove back to the outskirts of town, Helena's mind was racing. She had spent years running from her past, but now she was diving headfirst into it. The fear and uncertainty were overwhelming, but Carlos's presence gave her strength. When they arrived at the house, it looked even more foreboding in the twilight. The shadows seemed to stretch out towards them, and the air was thick with the weight of forgotten memories. They approached the house with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Carlos pushed open the door, and they stepped inside once more. The dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the silence was almost deafening. They made their way through the house, retracing their steps from their previous visit. In the attic, they resumed their search through the trunk of documents. Helena found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. She carefully untied the bundle and began to read. The letters were from Maria Rodriguez, addressed to various family members. They spoke of love, loss, and a growing sense of fear leading up to the fire. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was written shortly before the fire and hinted at a conflict within the family. "Carlos, listen to this," Helena said, her voice trembling. Maria wrote, "I fear for our safety. There are forces at play that I do not understand. We must protect the child at all costs." Carlos's eyes widened. This proves there was something more to the fire. We need to find out who Maria was afraid of and why. As they continued to sift through the documents, they found more references to a mysterious figure who seemed to have a vendetta against the Rodriguez family. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still many gaps. Determined to uncover the truth, they left the house with a renewed sense of purpose. They knew their investigation would be difficult and dangerous, but they were no longer alone in their quest. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead and find the answers they sought. The night was falling as they drove back to town, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink. Helena looked at Carlos, her heart filled with gratitude and hope. "Thank you for helping me with this, Carlos. I couldn't do it without you." Carlos smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "We're in this together, Helena. We'll find the truth, no matter what it takes." As they reached the town, the lights were beginning to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the streets. The sense of camaraderie and shared purpose between them grew stronger with each passing moment. They knew that their journey was far from over, but with each step they took, they were closer to unraveling the mysteries of their intertwined pasts. The following morning, Carlos and Helena met at the cafe once again, eager to continue their investigation. The cafe was bustling with early morning activity, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. They found a quiet corner table and spread out their notes and documents from the previous day. "We need to follow up on the clues we found in those letters," Carlos said, his voice determined. "Maria Rodriguez mentioned someone she feared. We need to find out who that was." Helena nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. "And we need to understand why they would want to harm the Rodriguez family. There must be something we're missing." Their first stop was the town's courthouse, where they hoped to find more records about the Rodriguez family and any legal disputes they might have been involved in. The courthouse was an imposing building, its stone facade and tall columns giving it an air of authority. Inside, they were directed to the archives room, where they began searching through old records and files. It was a painstaking process, but their persistence paid off. They found several documents that hinted at a long-standing feud between the Rodriguez family and another prominent family in town, the Silvas. "Look at this," Carlos said, showing Helena a legal document. "It looks like there was a land dispute between the Rodriguez and the Silvas. This could be the motive we were looking for." Helena scanned the document, her brow furrowing. If the Silvas had something to gain from the Rodriguez downfall, it makes sense they might have been involved in the fire. But we need more proof. They continued their research, uncovering more about the history of the feud. The Silvas had been trying to acquire a piece of land that the Rodriguez family owned, but the Rodriguezes had refused to sell. The tension between the families had escalated over the years, culminating in several heated confrontations. Armed with this new information, Carlos and Helena decided to visit the current head of the Silva family, hoping to gain more insight into the feud and the events leading up to the fire. They drove to the outskirts of town, where the Silva estate was located. The estate was grand and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the abandoned Rodriguez house. They were greeted by Mr. Silva, a stern-looking man in his 60s who eyed them with suspicion as they explained their purpose. "We're looking into the history of the Rodriguez family," Carlos began. "We found some records that suggest there was a dispute between your family and theirs." Mr. Silva's expression hardened. "That was a long time ago. Best to let old grudges die." Helena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We're not here to stir up trouble, Mr. Silva. We're just trying to understand what happened to our families. We think it might help us find closure." Mr. Silva studied them for a moment before nodding. "Very well. Come inside, and I'll tell you what I know." They followed him into the house, where he led them to a study filled with books and old photographs. He gestured for them to sit down and then began to speak. "The feud between our families goes back generations," Mr. Silva said. "It started over a piece of land that both our families claimed. My ancestors believed the land rightfully belonged to us, but the Rodriguez family refused to sell. There were many arguments and even a few physical confrontations." Carlos and Helena listened intently as Mr. Silva recounted the history of the feud. He confirmed that tensions had been high in the years leading up to the fire, but he insisted that his family had no involvement in the tragedy. "My father was devastated when he heard about the fire," Mr. Silva said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Despite our differences, he never wanted harm to come to them. He tried to help with the rescue efforts, but it was too late." Helena leaned forward, her eyes searching Mr. Silva's face. "Do you know if anyone else might have had a reason to harm the Rodriguez family?" Mr. Silva shook his head. "I can't say for sure. There were always rumors and suspicions, but nothing concrete. Many believed it was just a tragic accident." Despite Mr. Silva's assurances, Carlos and Helena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. They thanked him for his time and left the estate, their minds buzzing with new questions. As they drove back to town, they discussed their next steps. "We need to talk to more people who were around at the time," Carlos said. "Maybe someone remembers something that could help us." Helena agreed. "We should also check out the old town records and see if there's anything we missed. There might be more clues hidden in there." They spent the next few days interviewing elderly townspeople and combing through additional records. They heard various stories and rumors, but nothing that provided a definitive answer. However, they did learn more about the complex relationships between the town's prominent families and the underlying tensions that had existed for years. One afternoon, they visited Mrs. Delgado, an elderly woman who had been a close friend of Maria Rodriguez. She welcomed them into her home and listened patiently as they explained their quest. "I remember the fire very well," Mrs. Delgado said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Maria was a dear friend, and it broke my heart to lose her. There were always whispers that someone had set the fire, but no one ever found out who." Helena showed her the letters they had found. "Did Maria ever mention being afraid of someone?" Mrs. Delgado nodded. "She did. She was worried about a man named Victor. He was an associate of the Silvas, but there was something off about him. Maria felt he was dangerous." Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance. This was the lead they had been looking for. "Do you know where we can find this Victor?" Carlos asked. Mrs. Delgado shook her head. "He left town shortly after the fire and never returned. No one knows where he went." Despite this setback, they felt a renewed sense of determination. They were closer to uncovering the truth, and they wouldn't stop until they had all the answers. As they left Mrs. Delgado's house, Helena felt a surge of hope. "We're getting closer, Carlos." "I can feel it," she said. Carlos squeezed her hand. "We are, Helena. And we're going to find out what really happened, no matter what." As they walked back through the town, the sun setting behind them, they knew their journey was far from over. But with each step, they were uncovering more of the mystery, and their bond was growing stronger. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead and discover the truth about their intertwined pasts. Carlos and Helena returned to the cafe the next morning, eager to continue their investigation. The familiar surroundings offered a comforting routine as they spread out their notes and reviewed what they had learned so far. The discovery of Victor's involvement had opened up new possibilities, and they were determined to follow every lead. "We need to find out more about Victor," Carlos said, sipping his coffee. "If he was involved with the Silvas and left town after the fire, there must be a reason." Helena nodded, her eyes scanning their notes. "We should start by asking around if anyone remembers him. Even if he left town, someone might have kept in touch or heard where he went." Their first stop was the local bar, a gathering place for many of the town's older residents. They hoped to find someone who remembered Victor and could provide more information. The bar was dimly lit, with a few regulars nursing drinks at the counter. Carlos approached the bartender, a grizzled man named Joe who had been in town for decades. "Hey, Joe. We're looking for information about a man named Victor. He was around during the time of the Rodriguez fire. Do you remember him?" Carlos asked. Joe scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Victor, huh? Yeah, I remember him. Shady character, always seemed to be in the middle of trouble. Why are you asking about him?" Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance before Carlos replied, "We're trying to uncover the truth about the fire and our family's pasts. We think you might have been involved." Joe nodded slowly. "I see. Well, I don't know much about what happened to him after the fire, but I do know he used to hang out with a group of guys at the old mill. They might know more." Thanking Joe, they headed to the old mill on the outskirts of town. The mill was a decaying relic of the town's industrial past, now a hangout spot for those who preferred to stay out of sight. As they approached, they saw a few men gathered around a makeshift table, playing cards and smoking. Carlos took the lead, addressing the group. "We're looking for information about a man named Victor. He used to come around here. Do any of you know what happened to him?" One of the men, a burly fellow with a scar across his cheek, looked up. "Victor? Yeah, I remember him. He skipped town right after the fire. Heard he moved up north, to the city." Helena stepped forward. "Do you know why he left?" The man shrugged. "Word was he got spooked. Something about debts and unfinished business. That's all I know. It wasn't much, but it was a start." As they left the mill, Helena felt a sense of unease. "Carlos, do you think Victor might have been running from something more than just debts?" Carlos nodded. "It's possible. If he was involved in setting the fire, he might have been trying to avoid the consequences." Determined to follow this new lead, they decided to head to the nearest city where they hoped to find more information about Victor's whereabouts. The drive was long, and the city loomed ahead of them, a stark contrast to the peaceful town they had left behind. They started their search at the city's public records office, hoping to find any mention of Victor in the last few decades. After hours of searching through records, they found a reference to a man matching Victor's description. He had been involved in several business ventures, many of which had ended in legal disputes. "This guy really knew how to stir up trouble," Helena remarked, scanning the documents. Carlos nodded. "But it looks like he stayed under the radar. There's no recent information about him." Their next stop was a local bar where Victor was rumored to have frequented. The bar was crowded and noisy, a far cry from the quiet establishments in their hometown. They approached the bartender, a woman with bright red hair and a friendly demeanor. "Excuse me, we're looking for a man named Victor. He used to come here. Do you know him?" Helena asked. The bartender raised an eyebrow. "Victor, huh? Yeah, I know him. Haven't seen him in years, though. Last I heard, he was trying to lay low. He had a way of making enemies." Carlos leaned in. "Do you know where we might find him now?" She shook her head. "Sorry, no clue. But if he's still around, he'd be in the seedier parts of town. He always had a knack for getting into trouble." Undeterred, Carlos and Helena decided to check out some of the rougher neighborhoods. It was a daunting task, but they were committed to finding the truth. They spent the next few days asking around, following every lead, no matter how small. Their persistence paid off when they finally found a man who claimed to know Victor's whereabouts. He directed them to a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of the city. The building was decrepit, with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. They climbed the stairs to the third floor, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. Carlos knocked on the door of the apartment the man had indicated. After a tense moment, the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt man with sunken eyes. "Victor?" Carlos asked cautiously. The man nodded, his gaze wary. "Who's asking?" "We're not here to cause trouble," Helena said quickly. "We just want to talk." Victor hesitated before opening the door wider to let them in. The apartment was sparsely furnished, a stark contrast to the man's former life. They sat down, and Victor eyed them suspiciously. "What do you want?" he asked. Carlos took a deep breath. "We want to know the truth about the fire at the Rodriguez estate. We think you know something about it." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Why should I tell you anything?" Helena leaned forward, her voice earnest. "Because it's about our families. We deserve to know what happened." For a moment, it seemed like Victor might refuse. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. I didn't set the fire, but I knew about it. There were people who wanted the Rodriguez family out of the way. They paid me to keep quiet. Who were these people? Carlos asked, his heart pounding. Victor shook his head. I can't tell you that. They're powerful. Dangerous. If they find out I've talked. We'll protect you, Helena said firmly. Just tell us what you know. Victor looked at them for a long moment before nodding. All right. The people who paid me were connected to the Silvas. They had a lot to gain from the Rodriguez family's downfall. But there's more to it than that. There were other interests involved, people from outside the town who wanted that land. Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance. This was the breakthrough they had been looking for. Thank you, Victor, Carlos said. This means a lot to us. Victor nodded, his expression haunted. Just be careful. There are still people who don't want the truth to come out. As they left the apartment, Helena felt a sense of relief. They were finally getting closer to the truth, but they knew their journey was far from over. With renewed determination, they prepared to face the next challenges, knowing they had the strength and courage to uncover the secrets of their past. Carlos and Helena drove back to their town in silence, their minds racing with the information Victor had provided. The connections between the Silvas, the Rodriguez family, and the mysterious external interests painted a complex and dangerous picture. They knew they had to tread carefully, but their resolve to uncover the truth had only strengthened. As they arrived back in town, they decided to regroup at the cafe. The familiar environment offered a sense of comfort amidst the turmoil. They found their usual table and spread out their notes and documents, reviewing everything they had learned so far. We need to confront the Silvas again, Carlos said, his voice steady. They're involved in this more deeply than we initially thought. Helena nodded, her expression determined. But we need to be smart about it. If they're as dangerous as Victor said, we can't just walk in there without a plan. They decided to gather more evidence before making their move. Over the next few days, they talked to more townspeople, delving deeper into the history and secrets of the Rodriguez and Silva families. They uncovered more details about the land dispute and the external interests that had played a role in the tragedy. One evening, as they were compiling their findings, they were approached by Maria, a middle-aged woman who had overheard their conversations in the cafe. She introduced herself as a former maid for the Rodriguez family and offered to share what she knew. I've kept quiet all these years out of fear, Maria said, her voice trembling. But it's time the truth came out. I know things that can help you. Carlos and Helena listened intently as Maria recounted her memories. She spoke of the tensions between the families, the strange visitors who had come to the house in the weeks leading up to the fire, and the fears that had permeated the household. Maria Rodriguez was a kind woman, Maria said, tears in her eyes. She didn't deserve what happened to her and her family. Those men who visited, they were not from around here. They were businessmen, and they were ruthless. Helena squeezed Maria's hand. Thank you for telling us this. It helps a lot. We promise to bring justice to your friends. Armed with this new information, Carlos and Helena felt ready to confront the Silvas. They drove to the Silva estate, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they approached the grand house, they were met by Mr. Silva at the door. We need to talk, Carlos said firmly. It's about the Rodriguez family and the fire. Mr. Silva's expression hardened, but he stepped aside to let them in. They followed him to his study, where he gestured for them to sit. Why are you digging up old graves? Mr. Silva asked, his tone harsh. Helena met his gaze steadily. Because the truth needs to come out. We know about the land dispute, the external interests, and Victor's involvement. We need to know your part in all of this. Mr. Silva's eyes flickered with something unreadable. You think you know everything, but you have no idea how deep this goes. Then tell us, Carlos demanded. Help us understand. For a moment, it seemed like Mr. Silva might refuse. Then he sighed heavily and began to speak. The land was valuable, more than you can imagine. Those businessmen, they were willing to do anything to get their hands on it. My family was pressured to sell, but the Rodriguezes stood in the way. When they refused, things escalated. Did you know about the fire beforehand? Helena asked. Mr. Silva shook his head. No. I suspected something might happen, but I didn't know it would be that. When the fire broke out, it was already too late. I tried to help, but... His voice trailed off, and he looked away, clearly troubled by the memories. Carlos leaned forward. Who were these businessmen? Do you know their names? Mr. Silva hesitated before answering. I don't know all their names, but one of them was a man named Richard Langley. He was the ringleader, the one who orchestrated everything. Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance. This was a crucial piece of information. Where can we find Langley? Carlos asked. Mr. Silva shrugged. Last I heard, he was still involved in shady business deals. You might find him in the city, but be careful. He's dangerous. They thanked Mr. Silva for his cooperation and left the estate, their minds racing with the new lead. The next step was to track down Richard Langley and uncover his role in the tragedy. As they drove back to town, Helena couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. Carlos, what if Langley tries to stop us? He's not going to like us poking around. Carlos reached over and took her hand. We'll be careful, Helena. But we can't stop now. We're too close to the truth. The following day, they made preparations for their trip back to the city. They gathered all the evidence they had collected and made copies of crucial documents, just in case something happened to the originals. They also informed a few trusted friends in town about their investigation, ensuring that someone knew what they were up to. With everything in place, they set off for the city once more, determined to find Langley and bring the truth to light. The drive was tense, and both Carlos and Helena felt the weight of their mission pressing down on them. When they arrived in the city, they began their search by visiting the addresses linked to Langley in the public records. Their efforts led them to a high-rise office building in a more affluent part of the city. They entered the building and took the elevator to the floor listed on Langley's most recent business registration. As they stepped out of the elevator, they were met by a receptionist who eyed them suspiciously. "Can I help you?" she asked. "We're here to see Richard Langley," Carlos said. "We have some business to discuss." The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" Helena stepped forward. "No, but it's urgent. Please, we need to speak with him." After a moment of hesitation, the receptionist picked up the phone and dialed. She spoke in hushed tones before nodding and hanging up. "Mr. Langley will see you now. Follow me." They were led down a corridor to a large, opulent office. Behind a massive desk sat Richard Langley, a man in his 50s with sharp features and an air of authority. He looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing. "What can I do for you?" Langley asked, his tone icy. Carlos took a deep breath. "We're here about the Rodriguez fire. We know you were involved." Langley's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." Helena stepped forward, her voice firm. "We have evidence linking you to the events leading up to the fire. We know you pressured the Rodriguez family to sell their land and that you had connections to Victor. We need the truth." Langley leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You two are quite persistent, I'll give you that. But you should be careful. Digging into the past can be dangerous." Carlos met his gaze steadily. "We're not backing down. Tell us what happened, or we'll take what we have to the authorities." Langley studied them for a moment before finally nodding. "Very well. But you won't like what you hear." He began to recount his version of the events, confirming much of what they already knew but adding new layers to the story. The fire, he revealed, had indeed been set deliberately, but he claimed it was an accident that things had escalated so far. The goal had been to scare the Rodriguezes into selling, not to kill anyone. As Langley spoke, Carlos and Helena realized just how deep the conspiracy went. The fire had been the result of greed and desperation, and the cover-up that followed was meant to protect those involved from facing the consequences of their actions. When Langley finished, he looked at them with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "Now you know the truth. What are you going to do with it?" Carlos and Helena exchanged a glance. They had the information they needed, but the next steps were critical. They had to decide how to use this knowledge to bring justice to their families. "We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened," Helena said. "And we're going to ensure that those responsible are held accountable." Langley smirked. "Good luck with that. You'll need it." As they left Langley's office, Carlos and Helena felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced the opposition and uncovered the truth. Now, it was time to take the final steps towards justice. Carlos and Helena returned to their hotel room, the weight of Langley's revelations pressing heavily on their minds. They spent the evening reviewing their notes, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. It was clear now that the fire had been a deliberate act of intimidation gone horribly wrong, orchestrated by Langley and his associates. "We have everything we need to expose this," Carlos said, his voice resolute. "But we need to be smart about how we do it." Helena nodded, her determination matching his. "We should contact a journalist or someone who can help us get this story out. It's too big for us to handle alone." The next morning, they reached out to several investigative journalists in the city, explaining their story and providing the evidence they had gathered. One journalist, Rachel Martinez, expressed immediate interest and agreed to meet them. Rachel was a seasoned reporter known for her work on exposing corruption and uncovering hidden truths. She met them at a small cafe, her demeanor professional and focused. Carlos and Helena laid out their findings, and Rachel listened intently, occasionally taking notes. "This is huge," Rachel said after they had finished. "But you're right, we need to handle this carefully. Langley and his associates won't go down without a fight." Rachel agreed to take on the story and began working on a comprehensive article that detailed the events leading up to the fire, the involvement of the Silvas and Langley, and the subsequent cover-up. She promised to protect their identities as sources and assured them that the truth would be brought to light. While Rachel worked on the article, Carlos and Helena returned to their hometown, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. They knew that once the story broke, there would be backlash, but they were prepared to face it together. Days passed in a blur of preparation and nervous waiting. Finally, Rachel called them with the news that the article was set to be published. It would appear in the next day's edition of a major newspaper, and she had also arranged for a television segment to air on the evening news. That night, Carlos and Helena watched the news broadcast in tense silence. The segment began with a somber introduction, detailing the tragic fire and the long-standing mysteries surrounding it. Then, Rachel's report began, revealing the evidence and connecting the dots for the viewers. As the broadcast ended, Helena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's done," she said softly. "The truth is out there." The following morning, the town was abuzz with the news. The article had been published, and it seemed like everyone was talking about it. Reactions were mixed, some were shocked and outraged, while others were skeptical or defensive. But the most important thing was that the truth was finally out in the open. Carlos and Helena braced themselves for the inevitable backlash. As they walked through town, they could feel the weight of curious and judgmental stares. They were approached by several townspeople, some offering support and others demanding answers. Mr. Silva was among the first to confront them. He stormed up to Carlos, his face red with anger. "What have you done?" he demanded. "You've destroyed my family's reputation." Carlos stood his ground. The truth needed to be told. "Your family was involved in something terrible, and it's time for justice." Mr. Silva's expression hardened, but he said nothing more and walked away, leaving Carlos and Helena to face the rest of the town. Amidst the chaos, they received support from unexpected sources. Mrs. Delgado, the elderly friend of Maria Rodriguez, approached them with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Maria can finally rest in peace." Their most significant challenge came when they received a summons to a town hall meeting, called to address the revelations in the article. The meeting was packed with townspeople, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and concern. Carlos and Helena took the stage, their hearts pounding. Rachel had advised them to be honest and straightforward, and they intended to follow her advice. Carlos began by recounting his family's history and the tragic accident that had haunted him for years. Helena followed, sharing her story of escape and the search for her past. "We didn't do this to hurt anyone," Helena said, her voice clear and steady. "We did this to find the truth and to honor our families. The Rodriguez family deserved better, and so did this town. It's time to face the past and make things right." There was a moment of silence before the questions began. Some were supportive, while others were harsh and accusatory. But Carlos and Helena answered them all, standing firm in their resolve. As the meeting drew to a close, Rachel stood up from the audience. "I've been investigating corruption and cover-ups for years," she said. "What Carlos and Helena have done is incredibly brave. They've exposed the truth, and now it's up to all of us to decide what to do with it." The meeting ended with a sense of unresolved tension, but also a glimmer of hope. Carlos and Helena knew that their journey was far from over, but they had taken a crucial step towards justice and healing. In the days that followed, the town began to process the revelations. Some people reached out to Carlos and Helena with words of support, while others remained distant or hostile. But through it all, they felt a growing sense of solidarity and purpose. One afternoon, as they walked through the now familiar streets, Carlos turned to Helena. "We did it," he said, a hint of amazement in his voice. "We actually did it." Helena smiled, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "Yes, we did. And we'll keep fighting for the truth, no matter what." As they walked on, side by side, they knew that their bond had only grown stronger through their shared journey. They had uncovered the past, faced the opposition, and brought the truth to light. And now, they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The days following the town hall meeting were a whirlwind of emotions and events. The story that Carlos and Helena had brought to light continued to ripple through the town, affecting everyone in different ways. While some residents remained skeptical or resentful, many others began to rally around the need for justice and reconciliation. Carlos and Helena found themselves at the center of the town's attention, a position neither had sought but both were determined to handle with grace. They continued to work with Rachel, who was committed to following up on the story and ensuring that those responsible faced the appropriate consequences. One morning, as they were having breakfast at the cafe, their usual quiet moment was interrupted by a visitor. It was Mr. Thompson from the Historical Society, his demeanor more subdued than usual. He approached their table with a small, hesitant smile. "I wanted to thank you both," Mr. Thompson said, his voice sincere, "for uncovering the truth. It's been a long time coming, and the town needed this. I've lived here all my life, and I never thought I'd see the day when these secrets were finally brought to light." Carlos nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. We're just glad to have been able to do our part." Helena smiled at Mr. Thompson. "Your support means a lot to us. We hope this can be the start of healing for everyone." As Mr. Thompson left, Carlos and Helena felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew their journey was far from over, but the support they were receiving bolstered their resolve. They decided to visit the Rodriguez house one last time, hoping to find some sense of closure. The old house stood as a silent witness to the past, its walls bearing the scars of the tragedy that had unfolded within. They walked through the rooms, now more familiar than ever, and felt a deep connection to the history they had uncovered. In the attic, they found the trunk of documents they had previously explored. This time, they sifted through them with a different perspective, their understanding of the past now complete. Among the letters, they discovered one last, unopened envelope addressed to Maria Rodriguez. Helena carefully opened the envelope, revealing a letter written in delicate handwriting. It was a letter of apology from a member of the Silva family, expressing regret for the feud and the events that had transpired. The letter was a heartfelt plea for forgiveness, a gesture of reconciliation that had never been sent. Tears filled Helena's eyes as she read the letter aloud to Carlos. "This could have changed everything," she said, her voice trembling. "If only it had been delivered." Carlos placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's never too late to seek forgiveness and make amends. We can honor their memory by helping to heal the wounds of the past." With renewed determination, they left the house and headed back to town. They decided to share the letter with Mr. Silva, hoping it would serve as a catalyst for reconciliation. Mr. Silva's reaction was one of profound shock and sorrow. He read the letter several times, his eyes filling with tears. "I had no idea," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for bringing this to me. It's time to make things right." In the weeks that followed, a series of community meetings were held to address the issues raised by the revelations. These meetings, facilitated by Rachel and other concerned citizens, aimed to foster dialogue and healing within the town. Carlos and Helena played an active role, sharing their journey and encouraging others to come forward with their own stories. Slowly but surely, the town began to change. The old divisions and resentments started to fade as people came together to build a more united community. The Rodriguez house, once a symbol of tragedy, was restored and turned into a community center dedicated to the memory of the families involved. Carlos and Helena continued to support each other through the process, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They knew that their journey had only just begun, but they were ready to face the future together, armed with the truth and a renewed sense of purpose. One evening, as they stood outside the newly opened community center, Carlos took Helena's hand. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with pride and love. "We really did it." Helena smiled, her heart full. "Yes, we did. And we'll keep doing it, together. No matter what comes our way." As they walked away, hand in hand, they knew that their journey had transformed them both. They had faced their fears, uncovered the truth, and brought healing to a town long burdened by its past. And in doing so, they had found a new beginning, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. The future was still uncertain, but Carlos and Helena were ready to face it together, knowing that the strength of their bond and the power of their shared purpose would guide them through whatever lay ahead.